you've got a drop-down menu of how you want to move value. Like, what's the way you're going to move it today? You're going to move it by buying some luxury handbags and, in Harrods or Bicester Village, shipping them to China. That's one way of doing it. You're going to buy a load of, Tether or other cryptocurrency and ship it to Cambodia. That's one way of doing it. Or are you going to just use a load of cash, stick it in a shipping container and send that abroad? You can do that too. So the point I'm making is it's incredibly easy to be a criminal. And there is supposedly a giant global infrastructure to stop money laundering. It is no exaggeration to say that it is completely failing to do its job.
When it comes to the relationship between capitalism and crime, people on the left, social democrats, socialists, progressives, generally think of oppression and exploitation. They say that people turn to crime, broadly speaking, because they can't make ends meet through legitimate means. They've been left behind by mainstream economy, the way that most people earn money most of the time. That may be true. You might agree, you might disagree. But the truth is there's a more interesting and important relationship between capitalism and crime than that. Namely, the relationship between the state and currencies and money laundering. Money laundering is estimated to be worth globally trillions of dollars a year. And the basic infrastructure for all of that is the dollar, the euro, and the pound, some other currencies too, but almost all of it is in US dollars. So while the White House talks about a war on drugs and a war on crime, the currency being issued by the Federal Reserve is the infrastructure that allows much or nearly all of that crime and all of those drugs to be produced and distributed around the world. And here's where things get really interesting, because you know what? It turns out those in power don't really care about much of this. So what is money laundering? Why should you care about it? Does it look different in places like China and Russia than it does in Europe and the United States? And what do vape shops, NFTs, and luxury watches have in common? This is such an important conversation. I want to talk about crypto. I want to talk about terrorism, sanctions, debanking. This issue is so much bigger than I realized until a short while ago. Until I read this fabulous book, Everybody Loves Our Dollars by Oliver Bullough. Really, really, really important intervention in a topic that isn't talked about very much, but is absolutely on your high street, I promise. Oliver, what a pleasure. Welcome to Downstream.
It's really good to be here.
Very happy to talk to you. We are talking about your new book, Everybody Loves Our Dollars. Very bling, intentionally bling cover. This isn't the sort of thing we generally talk about on Novara Media. We normally talk about political economy, globalisation, deep history, identity, culture. And, we're pitched books by people regarding all kinds of topics. And just 50 pages in, I was hooked. Not just by the pace of the writing and the stories, but the hypothesis, which is that money laundering is this enormous, enormous thing, so much bigger than I think anybody really recognizes. Put some numbers on that. How big is money laundering as a global phenomenon, to the best of our understanding?
Well, it's funny you say, you talk about globalization and everything. It is something that we should associate with money laundering. As you say, this is a giant parallel financial industry, an informal, certainly underground financial industry. The size of it, these are obviously estimates. We have no reliable tax returns, sadly, from the world's, people traffickers and drug cartels and so on. But the estimate that's normally put on it is that the criminal economy, so therefore money laundering, is between 2 and 5% of global GDP, which is fortunately a very easy sum to do because global GDP is approximately 100 trillion US dollars. So we're looking at somewhere between 2 and 5 trillion US dollars being laundered globally every year, which is essentially the profits of all acquisitive crime that is committed everywhere in the world. And I think money laundering is seen as, like a lot of white collar crime, is seen as somehow a second order, a little bit, it's important, but it's not as important as, having your phone stolen or, God forbid, terrorism or, the mayhem that are inflicted by the drug cartels in Mexico. But money laundering is the support industry for all of those things, in the same way that in the formal economy, the financial services industry underpins, trade networks, shops, but getting a mortgage. All of those things are reliant on banks and building societies and so on. The criminal economy is completely reliant on money laundering. So essentially what I'm writing about is the support network for the world's worst people. This is what allows terrorism to happen. This is what allows the cartels to happen. This is what allows people trafficking to happen, is because they are able to take their wealth, feed it into this underground financial system, move it around a lot, and then make it look legitimate so they can spend it in the formal economy without anyone realizing that it's criminal wealth. So it is a hugely important part of the criminal economy. It is as globalized as any other industry, and yet it gets almost no attention, certainly very, very little attention from people who could make a big difference, which are the leaders of our governments.
And one nice formulation you have in the book is, 2 to 5 trillion. So low estimate of that, maybe same size economy as Turkey, GDP, and maximum maybe Japan. And you're saying, look, if we can just get that down to Sweden or the Netherlands, that would be a big win. And I thought that was a really nice, certainly from a policymaker's perspective, okay, that sounds plausible.
I mean, if you think about $5 trillion in terms of victims, the volume of victims. So I mean, a fraud, a form of crime that a lot of people in this country are familiar with is what's called push payment fraud, which is when often older people, my father was targeted towards the end of last year, older people are often targeted by people who phone them up on the phone or tell them, oh, there's a problem with your computer, or there's a problem with your phone, or there's a problem with your bank account. You just need to move some money to a different bank account to keep it safe while we sort this out. And then the money's gone. And there's, very little you can do about it. It's all sort of obfuscated in this very, well-organized fraud structure. That costs the UK about £1 billion a year. Now, the amount of money that is estimated to be laundered through the City of London every year, estimated by the British government's own figures, is hundreds of billions of pounds a year. So you're talking about that push payment fraud, which is a huge problem with massive number of victims who lose their life savings, is less than 1% of the amount of money that's laundered through this city every year. It's an unimaginable scale of devastation being wreaked on very vulnerable people, not just in this country, but globally. And there is this huge, well-organized industry to make sure that the people perpetrating these crimes are able to keep the money that they've stolen and the money they've extorted from other people. And, I mean, if you look at the war in Ukraine, why is Russia able to obtain components for the drones which it's building, even though they're supposedly under sanction? Because they can launder money via this money laundering system. It is, devastating all over the world. And it needs far more attention than it gets, which is why I've written the book.
Is it easier or harder than before? So in the 80s, you could open a bank account with any ID. You make up, name Mickey Mouse. Michael Mouse could start a bank account. Of course, you can't do that anymore. But at the same time, there's a greater amount of anonymity with regards to transactions with the online world. So which direction have things gone in over the last 25, 30 years?
I think if we go back a little bit further, so I mean, I think there's probably always been money laundering. I mean, the sort of apocryphal origin of the term money laundering is supposedly from Al Capone in Chicago back during the Prohibition years in the 1920s. And they would supposedly buy laundrettes and put their profits through there and just claim to have done more washes than they'd actually done and legitimize their wealth. That isn't actually the origin of the term money laundering. It's just a nice sort of post facto rationalization for it. But it really took off in the 1960s with the beginning of globalization, when it became far easier to move money between countries. You could move money to places like Switzerland, to places like the Cayman Islands, Panama, places that would look after your money and not ask too many questions any questions about where it came from. And then you have this sort of explosion in the 1980s when, you had massive deregulation of the financial system on both sides of the Atlantic. Money could flow freely. Everyone was booming. A lot of people buying drugs, which is, a major source of the revenue for that period. And in those days, money laundering was super simple. You took your money to the bank and you paid it in, and the bank was like, oh, thanks very much. That's great. And that was it. You were done. There's this incredible, in the Brinks bullion robbery in 1983, which is, remains, I think, the third biggest heist in British history. The huge amount of gold had been stolen from a warehouse. All the police in the country desperately looking for gold. Where is the gold? Trying to find it before it gets smuggled out of the country. There was a gold bullion dealer on the outskirts of Bristol that was buying so much gold for cash that they had to have special shipments of £10 million from the Bank of England to his branch of Barclays just to provide him with all the cash that he needed. Right? No one in the bank thought, gold bullion dealer, £10 million in cash, some discrepancy. They were just like, oh yeah, give the guy his money. That's how banks operated in those days. There was no conception that they should essentially have a broader responsibility to society than just facilitating business, that maybe they should ask what kind of business it is. So we brought in globally from the late 1980s and then particularly in the 1990s, really quite tough restrictions on financial institutions about what they could do. And specifically, they had to report suspicions that they had, which meant that that original model of just taking your cash to the bank and paying it in, that wasn't really possible anymore. But with that, because criminals are very entrepreneurial, they learn new ways of moving value around the place. Some of the techniques which have been widely used, what's called the Hawala network, widely used in the Middle East, was essentially repurposed to provide services in South America to move value for the drugs cartels. They couldn't use the banking system anymore, so they moved value in the form of stuff rather than in the form of money. This is now very widely used by Chinese money laundering gangs who've taken off. So although one door closed or sort of was made more shut than it had been, other doors opened as the criminal gangs learnt new ways of moving money. And then now, joyously for them, we also have cryptocurrencies, which are an incredibly useful and efficient and very hard to trace way of moving massive amounts of value around the world in the click of a finger. And so, in a way, to answer your question, laundering money in the way that it was laundered back in the go-go years of Miami Vice in the 1980s is harder than it was. But they have been able to add that technique to other techniques. So in a way, it's now easier because it's like you've got a drop-down menu of how you want to move value. Like, what's the way you're going to move it today? You're going to move it by buying some luxury handbags and, in Harrods or Bicester Village, shipping them to China. That's one way of doing it. You're going to buy a load of Tether or other cryptocurrency and ship it to Cambodia. That's one way of doing it. Or are you going to just use a load of cash, stick it in a shipping container and send that abroad? You can do that too. So it is, I suppose the point I'm making is it's incredibly easy to be a criminal. And there is supposedly a giant global infrastructure to stop money laundering. It is no exaggeration to say that it is completely failing to do its job.
I mean, not just completely failing. You explicitly say it's not even measuring what success looks like. There aren't even the objectives. That quote, of course, the Drucker quote, you can't manage what you don't measure. You can't manage the problem if you're not measuring progress or failure. And it doesn't feel like, we even know how we're failing or where we're failing or what progress would even look like.
Yeah, I mean, it feels a little bit like, trying to draw a parallel with treating a disease, it feels a little bit like as doctors who are being asked to treat a disease, they don't know what the symptoms of the disease are. They don't know what causes the disease. They don't know how prevalent it is. They don't know who has it, and they don't know how to treat it. So, and at the same time, if they get it wrong, they get fined. So it is it's probably not something that gets said too often on this podcast, but I do actually genuinely feel very sympathetic with the large banks here. They are spending really an enormous amount of money attempting to comply with the anti-money laundering laws, but without any real idea about whether they're succeeding or not. So, I mean, to put that into perspective, the global cost of compliance with anti-money laundering laws, the amount that mainly the large financial institutions are spending, is about $200 billion every year, just slightly more than that. And what could you do with $200 billion if you weren't doing this with it? Well, according to the UN estimates, that is enough money to solve world hunger and to provide clean water and sanitation for everyone on Earth, and to have $50 billion left over, right? That's how much money we are spending on fighting and failing to stop money laundering. And it is, I think, a real failure of politics that no one stops and says, is this money being spent wisely? Is this money being spent in the right direction? Are we doing the right things with this? Are we asking the right people to do things? Instead, it is just consistently doing the same thing and expecting different results.
I hope you're enjoying this interview as much as I'm enjoying having the conversation. You might remember a song by Razorlight. Perhaps you're a bit too young for this now, I don't know. And it was called Don't Go Back to Dalston. Well, on the 16th of February, I want you to come to Dalston. I want you to come to Earth Theatre in Hackney to see me in conversation with Ash Sarkar. And that's regarding the publication of her book, Minority Rule, in paperback. So like I say, that's at Earth Theatre in Hackney, 16th of February. The doors are open, I think, to all at 7:30 p.m. Great part of the world, Hackney. Lots of restaurants, lots of places to get a drink. It's going to be a fabulous conversation. It's about why the right seem to be winning so much and what we can do about it. Alongside us are also Dan Evans, Shanice McBean, and Michael Walker. So a great conversation. I hope you can join us. These events are fantastic. It's our first of the year. Really want to see you there. Buy a ticket now. Link is in the description below. So you've said two things there, which I want to put a pin in because we're going to come back to them because they're really critical to this whole book. One is crypto, the other is compliance. On the numbers as well, with regards to compliance, you're saying 200 billion a year. I believe that Starlink, a space-based 5G internet, which is globally available, cost about $30 billion to set up, right? Which is a pretty useful public good if everybody had free access to it. And you're saying it's 200 billion a year for
I
this.
think we could have our own one, which wasn't owned by a billionaire.
Or quite. That'd be quite nice, wouldn't it? Also, I suppose, again, for people watching or listening to this, they'll be thinking, okay, well, money laundering's bad. And they associate it with certain things like narco-terrorism, human trafficking. But the more I read this book, the more I just thought, everything is money laundering. Everything I'm seeing is money laundering. And we'll talk about that more as well, from the designer watches, this huge market now for ultra valuable luxury watches all over Instagram, to NFTs, to art, to vape shops in your high street. Everything seems like it could be money laundering. But anyway, so I'm glad you woke me up to that. But before we get to that, people's experience of money laundering or understanding of it obviously will come broadly from fictionalized dramas. How accurate is something like Ozark? I don't know if you've watched it.
I have.
The Netflix series, I love it. I think Marty's a great guy, very impressive human. How reflective or accurate is that of the broader situation in somewhere like the US and Mexico?
So I think that one, Ozark, is a lot of fun. And I think that another one which was quite fun, and I don't know if you saw, was Outlaws, Stephen Merchant's Bristol-based comedy about a bunch of misfits doing community service who end up by a series of weird coincidences involved in giant money laundering conspiracy, which is also fun. The structures, the use of shell companies, the use of bank accounts owned by shell companies, moving money between multiple bank accounts. All of these things are part of money laundering, and they're particularly part of money laundering, often how it's done in Western countries. Another really good one is the John Grisham book, The Firm, which came out, I think, in 1991. It was possibly his first book. They also made a film of it a couple of years later with Tom Cruise in the lead role, which isn't as good as the book, but it's still okay. And that's a very good reflection of what money laundering was like back then, the ideas of jets full of cash being flown to the Cayman Islands, being paid into banks, and so on. Where all of this slightly falls down, in my mind, is that the representation of money laundering in those shows is very much tends to be how it's done in Western countries, which are countries with a developed and very large financial system where their shell companies are readily available and so on. And we have completely neglected to understand money laundering as it's done in the rest of the world, particularly in the Middle East and in China, where the financial system is not so readily accessible, or in China it's tightly controlled by capital controls and so on. So there is much more need for ways of moving value outside the financial system. And because the reason I think that that's super interesting and super important is that essentially the way that they move value, which is via the movement of things, rather than via the movement of the kind of cash that you see in Ozark or The Firm or Outlaws, is that that's how we used to do it too before globalization, in that if you look at, say, the way the Medicis used to bank in Renaissance Florence, you could go into the branch in Venice or Rome or Florence and give them a quantity of coins and just say, I would like to be able to collect these coins in London or Bruges, and they would give you a piece of paper and you would go to London or Bruges and you would collect your coins. Now, they didn't ship the coins from Florence to London. That would have been crazy. They had money in London, which they could give you. And how they balanced the books between those two different centres is by moving stuff. They would move wool in one direction, silks or spices in the other direction, and hide the money laundering. And actually what's funny about it is they have the secret books of the Medicis, which can be read in the Florence archive. And they were providing banking services to sort of cardinals and princes, people who were the kind of kleptocrats of their day. So it was very much a kind of degree of money laundering was going on, is they would hide the transactions in the paperwork around the shipment of trade goods. And this is how the vast majority of the world money launders. It doesn't really involve money at all. And that's one of the reasons why the term money laundering is a little bit annoying, is that really you're talking about value. And you can move value just as easily in the form of a watch, which you can buy an expensive watch, stick it in your wrist, fly out the country to another country and sell it at the other end. You've moved the value just as successfully, in fact, probably rather more successfully than if you moved it via a financial institution. No one is any the wiser. And yet in fact, almost all of the scrutiny that we do as a society to try and stop money laundering is based on bank accounts. We're looking at bank accounts all the time. And it feels a little bit to me like we've built a castle, or we just tried to build a castle to keep our economy safe from criminal money. And part of the wall is very high and well fortified, equipped with all the latest weapons and AI and everything. And meanwhile, everywhere else you can just walk through. There's maybe a grassy mound, which is completely undefended because it's so easy to move money in and out. And so one of the points I'm trying to make in the book is to try and give this global sense of what money laundering looks like and say it isn't just the view that you get if you read The Firm or watch Ozark or Outlaws or whatever, or other, Western fictionalized versions of money laundering, that globally speaking, this is a far more sophisticated and, tangible in the literal sense form of value moving. It isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet.
That to me was, I don't like to use the word, the sort of the sexy part of the book. If you were a Netflix, commissioning editor or something, you want to make a series, the stuff you're talking about in Russia with regards to Bitcoin and Tether, or the stuff you're talking about with regards to China and people bringing back luxury goods from the UK, thousands of miles, taking it back to wherever, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, etc. That to me was the really, really interesting stuff. So you mentioned Bicester Village a moment ago, and of course some people will know that is one of the big attractions for overseas tourists in this country. It's a retail experience, lots of luxury goods, you can buy a ton of stuff. What's the story about Bicester Village and global networks of money laundering?
So, Bicester Village gets, I feel a little bit bad for Bicester Village in that I do focus on them a bit in the book. The reason Bicester Village is so, easy to understand what I'm about to talk about is because it is a concentrated place where there are lots of luxury goods shops all in the same place. So you can see a phenomenon that otherwise is a bit more dispersed, all happening all in one place. But particularly for Chinese money laundering gangs, it is very difficult for them to move money between China and other countries because of the restrictions that the Chinese government puts on moving money out of China. You can't move more than $50,000 in a year out of China. And if you are a wealthy Chinese person, that isn't nearly enough money to sustain what you want to sustain, whether that's sending your kids to university in this country or to go gambling in Vancouver or whatever. So they have created a separate, parallel underground financial system that allows this movement of extensive amounts of value in and out of China unhindered via the trade network. And so there is a huge demand in China for luxury goods, particularly luxury goods that are unavailable there or that are cheaper than what are available there. And so they will essentially employ large numbers of Chinese students who are based in European countries to go to luxury goods shops, whether that's in Bicester Village or in London or in Paris or wherever, and to buy luxury goods, package them up and send them back to China. Now, where do they get the money from to do that if they can't get money out of China? Well, they have a service with drugs gangs who generate a lot of cash. And that cash is then handed over to collectors. The students pay it into their bank accounts and then go and buy stuff in Bicester Village, or they might just buy it with cash. And then those goods are shipped to China, and then everyone in China who wants luxury goods and isn't otherwise able to get them is happy. But then that raises the question, how do the drug dealers get paid? They've handed over a load of cash to some people, and they are therefore looking for something to pay for that cash. And this is where the Chinese trade networks can come in that the Chinese are able, via contacts in South America, to pay that debt with shipments of cocaine from Colombia or Bolivia. And then people in Colombia or Bolivia are being paid in turn from China with shipments of the precursor chemicals or whatever to make that. So you have a giant triangular, essentially, trade system, in which the bit from Britain to China or from Europe to China, more broadly, is being paid in luxury goods. Now, those luxury goods, they could be handbags, because handbags are a good concentrated store of luxury. They fit everyone. You don't need to worry about the sizing. Or they could be luxury clothes. They could be wristwatches. It could be jewelry. It could be anything. But these are desirable products, the kind of thing that you would see on social media, the kind of thing it might be difficult to get in China, certainly at a reasonable price. And the value of this, they call it Daigou trade between Europe and China is, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to estimate, but it's definitely in the tens of billions of dollars is going every year. But if you're thinking about tens of billions of dollars going that way, there must also be tens of billions of dollars coming the other way. Something must be paying for it. And that is paying for it is essentially the trade that produces the cocaine that is then sold to generate the money that is then spent on the trade goods. And the challenge, in a way, for this, and we saw this in France last year, it was really interesting, is that in France, in order to try and restrict this kind of money laundering, tax residents in France are not allowed to spend more than 1,000 euros in cash at any one time. That's the maximum you can spend in cash. But that doesn't apply to people who aren't tax resident. But they had a policy proposed by the finance ministry that they would equalize that. So that it was a limit that applied to everyone. If you were in France, you couldn't spend more than 1,000 euros in cash. And there was such an outcry from the vendors of luxury goods, which is a very influential lobby in France. They've got some very, very big and powerful luxury goods companies, that they scrapped the policy. They said it's fine. You can set the limit for non-residents is 15,000. So there's such a source of demand for the French-made luxury goods from money launderers that essentially the luxury goods companies were able to put pressure on the French government to prevent them from doing anything about that. And it's just a really interesting insight. You don't get them very often, a really interesting insight into the kind of impact on the real economy of the way that these funds are being siphoned into it.
So you're saying tens of billions of dollars. I presume that's coming for the most part from a cluster of Western European countries. I mean, people aren't buying luxury goods in Hungary and taking it back to China, or are they? What are the main countries here in Europe?
So yeah, I mean, you're obviously looking at Italy, France, the UK. Though interestingly, you see this exactly the same model, but with a different outcome. So this is often called the Vancouver model of money laundering, because one of the first places this was ever really picked up on was in British Columbia, where you had a lot of this demand was not to buy luxury goods, but was to gamble. There was a casino that was very popular with Chinese punters. It was, and so a lot of people wanted to be able to come over from China to Vancouver, which has a very significant Chinese community, to see relatives and friends and so on, and to go and gamble. But they didn't have access to money that they could gamble with because they couldn't get all their money out of China. So they would take delivery of large quantities of cash from Canadian criminal gangs, often drug dealers, which they would then gamble with. And in return, that debt that they would have, because obviously they would lose a lot of the money while gambling, because that's how it works, that debt they would then pay by shipping drugs from wherever to the Canadian criminal gangs. And what was really interesting is it took a long time for the Canadian authorities to figure out what was going on, and indeed to figure out whether anyone was committing a crime, because this doesn't look like money laundering. Traditionally, money laundering, you have money, you put it into a bank and you take out a check or some form of piece of paper which is equal to the value of the money you've paid in. But with this, what was weird is you had criminals delivering cash to gamblers who would then just lose all the cash. And you're like, but this isn't money laundering. It doesn't look like money laundering because you're not getting anything. You've just lost all this money. So how is that even a crime? But what you need to understand is when you step back and see the system as a whole, there is a circle of value exchange, which then includes other people who aren't present at that point, who are then delivering the drugs to keep the circuit going round, to keep generating the cash, which can then keep being gambled in the casino. And this is the same system that we're seeing with buying luxury goods in Europe, but we've also seen it in gambling in Sydney, in Australia, in Las Vegas, and in other places.
And the drugs that are being delivered to Canada, was that also to British Columbia, or was that?
Yeah, it would be British Columbia, but this became such a giant industry.
Because that is the hub of I don't know if you've been to Vancouver recently, but it's like they've got their own Skid Row, and if anything, it's worse than Skid Row.
It's pretty extraordinary.
It's really extraordinary. I don't think enough people in Europe realise how bad the problem is, and I wonder how sort of interlinked that is with this issue of money laundering.
Well, so certainly a lot of the people I was talking to in Vancouver when I was out there looking into this were for them, a lot of the problem that they now have with opioid addiction was driven by the fact that it became so necessary to import a lot of drugs to generate the cash which was demanded by the gamblers, that you ended up with a flood of product on the market in Vancouver that then created a lot of the addiction that you now see. And I agree, walking through or driving through downtown Vancouver is a horrifying experience. Just the extent of the addiction, which is just there on full display, is really appalling. And a lot of that issue certainly according to the people I was talking to there, who a lot of people who'd worked in both analysing and attempting to try and prosecute some of these gangs and what they're up to, a lot of that issue was caused by the fact that there was just so much demand for cash that there became an equal demand for drugs to be supplied. So it is a very cheap way of laundering money. This sounds like a strange way of describing it, but in the old days, when you had money and you gave it to a professional money launderer, their job was to try and put that money in a bank. That's what they were trying to do. And after the banks started to make checks, that became quite difficult. You had to find a corrupt banker. You had to, break up the money into small packages, pay it into lots of banks. It was quite a laborious and expensive process. Now, the way that the Chinese gangs do it, however, is completely different to that, in that they have people who want to get rid of cash and they have people who want cash. So you're just connecting supply and demand. So they're able to essentially to cut what they're charging down to almost nothing. It's an incredibly cheap way of laundering money, which means that the profits for the criminal gangs become much greater. They don't have so much expense of as it were, legitimizing their wealth anymore, which means that there is more profit in crime. There is therefore more crime, which is precisely the opposite of what we were supposedly doing in tackling money laundering. The whole point of tackling money laundering is to make it more difficult, therefore more expensive, therefore to make crime less profitable.
One of my favourite parts of doing these interviews with fascinating people, talking about fascinating things, is the stuff you don't get to see. The personality they have, the anecdotes they tell, the insights that don't quite make the cut necessarily. And that is why we started a newsletter, the Downstream newsletter, to send you all of the things that don't quite get in the video. If you're already subscribed to that newsletter, don't worry. You'll be getting that very shortly. But if you're not, you can and should subscribe at novara.media/downstream newsletter. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy my weekend newsletters. Less pressure, you can open at your ease. It's quite relaxing for once. I wouldn't often say that about email. So if you want to be an even deeper member of the Downstream community, go to novara.media/downstream newsletter, subscribe today, and be part of deep thought, deep history, deep present, and deep future. That's what we're trying to do here at Downstream. On the compliance stuff, what's the relationship between compliance and debanking? I think for most people in this country, the first time they heard the term debanking was Nigel Farage and NatWest, I think, in 2023, 2024? Yeah. So, how far back does this go, and why are banks debanking so many people? You've got a great statistic here. 2016, 45,000 people were debanked, or number of accounts being closed, 45,000. And by 2022, that goes to 343,000.
It is extraordinary, the numbers, and also extraordinary how little we hear about this, which I will talk about because it's really important. So the reason we have compliance is that a lot of the foundational principles of tackling money laundering were created very, very quickly in the late 1980s. When they were creating something called the Financial Action Task Force. And then they were slightly revised after 9/11 to help with tackling terrorist finance, but not really considered. So we had people who didn't really know very much of what they were talking about, working in a real rush, really, 40 years ago, trying to get something done which they didn't really know how to do. And one of the things they created was, and this was actually a British initiative, so yay, the UK, was that they felt that it would be a laborious amount of paperwork for the law enforcement agents to have to decide for themselves what transactions were suspicious. So instead, they outsourced the process of deciding what transactions in a bank were suspicious to the bankers themselves. They had to, if they have suspicions about a transaction, they have to file what's called a suspicious activity report. And if they don't do that, there are fines for not reporting a suspicious activity. Now, the problem with that, well, there are many problems with it, but the core problem is that if you are a clean financial institution, but you're very keen not to be fined, you will report anything that you might be suspicious of just to make sure you don't get fined. If you're a dirty financial institution, you won't report anything at all because you would be blowing the whistle on yourself. So basically what we've done is we've outsourced checks on money laundering to money launderers. And funnily enough, they don't tend to report on themselves very much, but there are very significant fines available for if you miss acts of money laundering, and particularly if you miss acts of terrorist finance. 9-figure fines from the US Department of Justice. Banks are very, very keen not to pay them. So in order to make sure that there is no prospect of them paying them, they will do anything at all to avoid being connected to money laundering, and particularly terrorist finance. And that second one, the terrorist finance, is really hard because unlike money laundering, terrorist financing tends to involve very small amounts of money. It's very hard to spot. The crime is committed at the very end of the process rather than at the beginning. So you can't really connect it necessarily to any crime either. So essentially, they will debank people for any reason at all. often Muslims. Muslims have, as a rule, distinctive names. There's a reason why Mohammed is supposedly the most popular boy's name in the UK. And so if you have the name of a designated terrorist, they could check whether you're the same person as that or not, or whether you're related or somehow know them, or they could just cancel your bank account anyway, because the chances are that you're not generating them much in revenue. So they just get rid of you and avoid the prospect of that being any kind of possible repercussions for the bank. You have no right to a bank account. So they will find that there is a connection, possible connection, purported connection. Maybe there's just been some article in the Daily Express, whatever. That's the reason they'll get rid of your bank account. There is no appeal. There's nothing you can do about that. You just have to find a different bank account. Now, that's incredibly shameful for someone to be told that you're losing your bank account, particularly if you've had a bank account at an institution for 20 years. Suddenly it's really dislocating. And if you publicize this and say, this is terrible, this has happened to me, then other banks definitely won't give you a bank account. So there is the inclination is just to keep this quiet. It's both shameful and bad for you to publicize this. So as you say, hundreds of thousands of bank accounts are being closed every year, and yet you hear almost nothing about it at all, except when it happened to Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage was debanked for political reasons, or certainly there were political reasons were taken into account when they decided to close his account at Coutts. And I think that's wrong, that they took into account his political views. I don't agree with the guy, but there's no reason not to give him a bank account. Where I feel that the problem arose with that story is it was presented as being somehow specific to Nigel Farage, or in the United States, where this is talked about as well, as somehow specific to right-wing people active in crypto industry. It isn't. The overwhelming majority of the people who are debanked are Muslims, often poor Muslims, or Muslim charities, or charities serving Islamic countries or Muslim beneficiaries. And they are often connected to funding terrorism completely spuriously, subject to really very intrusive checks on everything that they do, without, and this barely needs saying, it's so obvious, without noticeably having any success in tackling terrorism. The Taliban are back. They have got Afghanistan again. Terrorist groups are active across the Middle East, across Central Africa. All of these efforts we've been making since 9/11 to drive terrorist financing out of the financial system has clearly not succeeded in tackling terrorism, and yet we're still doing it anyway. And this is what I mean about continuously doing the same thing and the same thing, and expecting different results. We keep having this system which is based on bank compliance departments closing accounts, reporting things to the authorities. There's no one in the authorities to read the reports. You're closing accounts of just, ordinary, essentially not very well off people. And you're therefore achieving nothing at all apart from possibly radicalizing people who you probably don't want to be radicalizing in the first place. And you saw this again in this same pattern. It's absolutely infuriating. It really makes me very cross. Repeat itself after 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when suddenly there were lots of people of Russian origin living in Britain and other Western countries who had, because they were Russian, business connections with the country where they came from, and often with companies that were owned by oligarchs, because most of the Russian economy is owned by oligarchs. That's not an unusual thing to have if you're Russian. And because of those business connections, they were also being debanked. But meanwhile, the actual oligarchs, they were finding it perfectly fine to get banking services in Dubai, or they were able to get a court order in this country that meant they could have a monthly allowance of £60,000 or whatever to pay their living expenses. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians, whose only crime, in inverted commas, was the fact that they had once had business relations with someone before that person was even sanctioned, were losing their bank accounts in this country. And the most, for my mind, boneheaded example of this was not in the UK, but in Lithuania, where the allies of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny had left the country and they'd tried to set up something called the Free Russia Foundation. And they were told that they couldn't have a bank account unless they changed the name. They couldn't have something called the Free Russia Foundation, despite the fact that they were, essentially the exiled operation of the primary opposition group to Vladimir Putin. The fact that they had Russia in the title meant they couldn't have a bank account, which is bewildering to me, but very much indicative of the way the whole system sort of somehow functions.
That's the standout example, isn't it? We're going to isolate Putin through a range of financial measures, including the debanking of the primary opposition figure, Navalny, and the setup around him. Some of the other organizations you mentioned that have been debanked long before Nigel Farage, Jordan's Arab Bank, the Cordoba Foundation, and then in 2016, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So that's happening 7 years before Farage, got very little coverage in the media.
To my mind, there are so many really shocking examples of that. To my mind, the really extraordinary one was the Finsbury Park Mosque. Now, everyone who remembers the years around 9/11 will remember that the Finsbury Park Mosque was notorious as a centre of radical preaching in the years before 9/11. After 9/11, they brought in the Metropolitan Police and the other authorities to overhaul what they were doing, to change what they were doing, to make sure that they were no longer involved in that anyway. But then, because it was mentioned in an article about terrorism, years later, it was debanked anyway, even though they had already brought in the authorities and done everything they could to make sure that they were no longer associated with what they'd previously been associated with. But all it takes is one article in the media. And if you're, not a customer that's going to be generating a lot of fees for the bank, if you're not going to be taking out mortgages, structuring products, having expensive the kind of accounts that you pay for and so on, then they just don't care enough about you to do the checks on where your money comes from or whatever. This actually was the problem that Nigel Farage had, in that he had a bank account at Coutts, which is the bougie bit of NatWest, and he wasn't generating sufficient fees for them to be bothered to go through the potential reputational risk of being associated with him. And that is crazy to me. I mean, the guy is not, like him or loathe him, he's not a terrorist. He should be able to have a bank account.
I think that really irked him, didn't it? When that went public, that part of the story, actually, he's not that affluent. It sort of it bothered him a bit.
Yeah, but I could see why it would, right? I mean, it's not, and no one wants their private financial affairs to be discussed, do they? I think what was difficult about that story, and we see exactly the same thing happening in the US, which is something that the kind of Trumpy wing of the crypto industry refers to as Operation Choke Point 2.0 for reasons that I won't go into.
Isn't Mark Andreessen,
that lot, is that they have become convinced that debanking is something that only happens to people on the right of politics, who are enthusiastic about cryptocurrency, that they are convinced that this is driven by essentially a corrupt alliance between left-wing liberal elites and the banking industry that doesn't want competition, and that's why they're being driven out of the financial system. And they have not realized that debanking overwhelmingly affects the poorest people in society, particularly already marginalized and excluded groups, and that they are, they could be powerful allies for poor and excluded people in society who really need some help and need champions. But instead, they present this as being like this kind of discrete attack only on them, when it isn't. They are just, the visible tip of an iceberg, which is so much bigger than just Nigel Farage or Mark Andreessen or whoever.
Like you're saying, this could be hundreds of thousands of accounts.
So many people.
So yeah, at least tens of thousands of people. Obviously, probably far more than that.
I mean, in the chapter which I wrote about this issue in particular, I was focusing on a friend of mine who farms near where I live in Wales, who has a family connection, kind of amazing, very amazing story, going back to the Second World War with Somalia. His father fought there in the Second World War, won a Victoria Cross, but his friend, his sergeant, died in the battle, and in honor of his sergeant and in honor of the connection between, the two families, they sold the Victoria Cross towards the end of his life, bought this farm to be a place where ethnic Somalis from the UK could go to, camp out under the stars, see a side of Britain they wouldn't normally get, enjoy each other's company, learn about the traditions from their grandparents and so on. This is like a wonderfully wholesome experiment. I can't tell you how sort of fun it is to see these city kids. I mean, I'm a country boy, and seeing these city kids in their white trainers playing football in a field and chasing sheep around and walking up hills. It's just, it really a wonderful thing to have done. But talking to the community leaders who arrange these groups from sort of Cardiff and Manchester and Birmingham and London and so on, who go and stay in the campsite, the problems that they have when trying to gather, it doesn't cost very much, but they gather a bit of money to pay Hamish to put on the farm, to make it open for them, to provide the food and so on. That they collect the money and then they soon get called into the bank. Who are these people? Where's all this money coming from? Where did that money come from? Where did your money come from? Why do you have all of these people giving money? Why have you put the tag on the transaction? Why have you written that in Somali and not in English? It's just absolutely relentless harassment of people, and it's not like they're money laundering for the Sinaloa cartel. They're organizing a camping holiday to mid Wales. It's genuinely mad. And that's what is faced. And what's interesting is that chapter was serialized in The Guardian this week. And Hamish wrote to me after it came out to say that 30 of his friends had got in touch with him to say, oh yeah, that happened to me as well. And he didn't even know, because even though these are friends of his, the shame is so deep that they hadn't mentioned it.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, you said towards the start of our conversation, or maybe 20 minutes ago, that you felt sorry for banks. It's not necessarily their fault, and I mean that's true, because what's happened here is there are high incentives to debank people, and there are very low incentives to provide banking to people who aren't particularly profitable customers. That's certainly true, but then on the other hand, you've got, I think at the time it was the CEO of NatWest Group, talking about Farage being debanked allegedly at a dinner. This was reported, I believe, in the Telegraph. And there was a little bit of, schadenfreude about the whole thing. And I remember when that was a story and I was saying he shouldn't be debanked, and there were people on X, or, people who I would say are on the same political side as me saying, no, this is good, it's great. And I said, look, the people that lose out here are not the people you think are losing out. It's people like Palestine Solidarity Campaign or this gentleman. So the compliance stuff and debanking, super interesting. Another thing that was really interesting for me in this book, and we've talked about it a lot, but never in this context, is what's referred to here as the paradox of banknotes.
Oh, I love this.
It's so good. And there's a bit of political economy here as well, right? So we're obviously printing more cash all of the time, and yet we're using less money all of the time. There are many shops out there, people watching and listening will say, well, when I go to a shop, I can't use cash. They're using Apple Pay all the time. They're using Visa, debit card, online shopping, etc. We're using less and less cash all the time, but we're printing more and more cash. What's happening to that cash? Why are huge denominations of money so popular? And where is most of that cash? So where are most dollars and most pound sterling notes? Three big questions. What's happening? Why are we printing so much and we're not really seeing it? Why are the denominations so big? Where are they ending up?
So I'm really glad you've asked about this. And I feel that, in your company, I can slightly nerd out in a way that I wouldn't necessarily in all context. So the paradox of banknotes was identified about 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, by Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England. Though at the time he was the chief cashier of the Bank of England and therefore in charge of physical currency. And he gave a speech in which he said, isn't it interesting that, we are printing more cash all the time. The amount of currency in circulation, in both as a total amount and also as a proportion of our economy, is going up. And yet the amount of banknotes that are being used in everyday transactions is going down. And that has just accelerated since he said that. In the most recent figures we have from UK Finance, just 9% of transactions in the UK involved cash money. Most of them are, as you say, with, Apple Pay, Google Pay, cards or online or whatever. And yet the amount of banknotes last year, sterling banknotes, increased by about 10%. It's almost £100 billion worth of banknotes now. And that's nothing compared to what you see in the US or indeed in the EU. In the EU, they've got more than 1.5 trillion euros worth of banknotes in circulation, just hit an all-time high at the end of last year. In the US, hits an all-time high every month. It's about almost $2.5 trillion worth of banknotes. And I visited the factory where they print them, actually 2 factories where they print them, where they work round the clock in shifts to produce them. They managed to produce just over 15.5 million banknotes every single day, and yet they still can't keep up with demand. And they're building a new factory in Maryland to help maintain their production of banknotes. But what is very weird about that is that, central banks print banknotes, what's called elastically. If people want them, they print them. You can buy them off them whenever you want them. But we aren't using them. Ordinary people in every country, some countries use more than others. So in Germany and Austria, there's a higher proportion of people use cash, but it's still a falling proportion. And yet it goes up all the time. And central banks have come up with various explanations for this. It's related to prevalence of cash machines, about inflation and yada, yada. But it's been going on for so long now that we can see that those explanations can't be right, because those causes which they've identified have now been and gone. They're no longer the causes that they're causing it, and yet it's still happening. And to my mind, it's the solution to this paradox lies in looking at the mix of denominations that are being printed. If you look at the United States, 20 years ago, the most popular denominations were in order. The $1 bill was the most printed. The second was the $20 bill. And the third was the $100 bill, which makes sense. You could see why that would be the case. But then around 2008, the $100 bill overtook the $20 bill and became the second most printed denomination. And then 8 years later, it overtook the dollar bill. Now the most printed denomination in the US, in this giant factory in Fort Worth, Texas, is the $100 bill. About 80% of the dollars printed by value are in the form of $100 bills. And yet, if you were to take a $100 bill into the Starbucks in Fort Worth and try and buy a coffee with it, they would look at you politely and say, do you have anything smaller? You don't see them in the US. And this is because, by the Federal Reserve's own figures, most of them are exported. They send them overseas, either smuggled across the Mexican border or else elsewhere, where they become, essentially the retail day-to-day currency of the global criminal economy. And the same is true of pounds. I mean, in a more regional sense, that we don't have the global reach of dollars. And the same is true as well of euros and other currencies too, the Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, and so on. And it is particularly infuriating that you have a system when, banks are spending this very large amount of money on compliance. This is slightly why I said I sympathize with banks, in that they a lot is demanded of them, and they are spending a lot of money on attempting to do what's demanded of them, with less or more success. But at the same time, the governments that are demanding them of this are printing as fast as the printing presses can print, the most useful tool for criminals when it comes to evading the very checks that banks are doing, which is cash. And to add a little level of sort of what you might call corruption to the hypocrisy is that printing banknotes is an astonishingly profitable business to be in. Printing a $100 bill costs about 10 cents. I mean, it's maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, but about 10 cents. And yet it's worth $100 because it says $100 on it. So every single time you print one, you've earned yourself essentially $99.90. So every day that the Federal Reserve is printing $100 bills, it's earned itself about $1.5 billion. It is an amazingly easy way to make money. And so, I mean, it isn't technically making money, it's more of an interest-free loan. But anyway, it doesn't matter. You are still being given a lot of money. So you have this giant enabling of money laundering by governments in the form of the currency that they're printing, just unquestioning without, thinking about it. And not only are they enabling the crime that they are purporting to be fighting, but they're also earning a really decent living for themselves from doing so. This is how central banks fund themselves. So it is an amazing... the paradox of banknotes is an amazing sort of, it's almost like the dog that didn't bark. It's this very weird scandal that's never happened. I don't understand why it isn't more of a thing. Other people have tried to draw attention to it in the past. I didn't invent it, but it is weird that people talk about it and then it just never amounts to anything.
So just to reiterate your point, there's a war on drugs.
There is a war on drugs.
There's a war on drugs. There's a war on money laundering. We have to, as a global economy, about $200 billion worth of resources are allocated to fighting it.
Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people are losing their bank accounts as as a price of this war that we're waging.
Yeah. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve, de facto the US government as well, is overseeing the sort of the bedrock infrastructure for global money laundering with no real reservations. It could make some minor changes, like change the largest denomination of dollars. We'll talk about that more later. Yeah. And they do this because it makes them, you said it makes the Federal Reserve money. The estimate is that this basically generates tens of billions potentially for the US government.
I mean, or
saves tens of billions.
For the US government, this is a rounding error, really. Right. But for central banks, so central banks are independent. That's an important principle these days. And a key part of the independence of a central bank is that they fund themselves. They don't need to ask the government for money. If they did, they would be in the position that the BBC finds itself in or whatever. This is how they fund themselves. The profit that they make from what's this called seigniorage income is certainly one of the ways that they fund themselves. So they don't really want to think about it too much. No one wants to think about it too much. But very occasionally, people do say the quiet part out loud. There was when the single currency in Europe was being debated, and they were talking about in Europe what denomination they would use. And they said that they would have 100, 200, and 500 euro bills. They used to be 500 euro bills. You don't get them anymore. There was a congressional committee hearing in the US where they discussed that this was going to happen with genuine explicit concern that the $100 bill might lose, in their words, its franchise as the currency of choice for global criminals. And that would raise the cost of borrowing for the US government. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that they said it, but they did. And it is also really noticeable that, in the Federal Reserve, they print obviously a lot of money. Not all of those banknotes meet the high standards that they have for banknotes. Some of them are a little bit misprinted or offset or whatever. And they shred those. And what do they do with the shreddings? quite a lot of them are sold to law enforcement agencies, so law enforcement agencies can train their dogs of how to find hidden banknotes where they've been hidden by criminals. So, they clearly are aware of the fact that criminals are big users of their product because they sell spoiled product so police can train the dogs to find the criminals. And yet no one makes the connection of maybe we just shouldn't be doing this in the first place. We could be, if we weren't printing $100 bills, it would inconvenience no one ordinary, because ordinary people don't use $100 bills anyway. The same is true with £50 notes. I don't remember the last time I saw one. But they are, however, very popular with criminals because the larger the denomination, the more value you can carry around in a small box.
Just a quick question in regards to seigniorage. It's just come to mind. The Bank of England in this country wasn't independent until 1997. Obviously, the Fed, I think, goes back to the 1900s, 1910s. So what happened with seigniorage in this country? Did that money effectively go to the Exchequer, or did it stay with the Bank of England?
So the profits from seigniorage go to the Treasury, but the bank would sort of take its expenses. It's a really interesting, it's a fun bit in my previous book, which is called Butler to the World, which is about Britain's role in enabling global kleptocracy. Back in the 1950s and early 1960s, when the City of London was inventing offshore finance, there was this whole situation when the Treasury didn't really know what was happening. And I was talking to a Treasury official at the time. He was talking about the fact that they were essentially sort of saving, I mean, it was joking, but essentially saving candle ends to try and see, and wearing their gloves at work because everything was so, they had no money to keep the government going. Meanwhile, the Bank of England had, doormen in top hats and like these big coats. Everything was loaded because the Bank of England had this source of income and could maintain itself. So the Bank of England had lots of economists, lots of analysts. People knew what was happening very well in the offshore markets. The Treasury had no idea because they didn't have anyone. They couldn't afford anyone to look at it. So the Bank of England, even when it was, after it was nationalised in the 40s, but before it was then sort of given its, the government's blessing to go off and do what it liked by Gordon Brown, it still had this source of income for itself. Although it was effectively independent anyway. I mean, in that it had, if the governments had interfered with it in a really overwhelming way, it would have caused chaos in the financial markets. So even between 1947 and 1997, it wasn't as beholden to the government as the government might have liked.
And there's this conversation right now about multipolarity, the potential disintegration of US hegemony, dollar hegemony, which if you read this book, you think some of that may be a bit too presumptuous.
Certainly for criminals.
Certainly for criminals, right? But I wonder if we're moving away from a world where the dollar is the currency which underpins global trade. Is that going to be a hindrance to global criminal networks if there are less holdings of dollars? I know that's not happening, but if it did happen, and if there was a bigger role for renminbi and a bigger role for euro and a bigger role for metals, because obviously these are obviously still tradable, you've still got value in motion, but there's a lot more friction. Would that make it harder for criminals? Are we living in a really good paradigm for criminals in that you have, dollar hegemony and the Fed is doing what it's doing, et cetera? It feels like a sort of Goldilocks moment if you're a money launderer trying to work on a global scale.
Well, so, I mean, the problem for criminals with the dollar being the dominant currency is that the United States used to be the only country that really enforced rules around financial crime in any meaningful sense at all. There was a tiny little bit. I mean, Italy was quite good because of the mafia. Spain's got bits and bobs. But really, most Western countries didn't bother doing anything with this at all. What's interesting now, I think, with the decline of the dollar, but the rise of dollar-denominated cryptocurrencies, of which the most famous, obviously, is USDT, Tether's USDT, is that this is a dollar, but without the downsides, in that it isn't cleared via a New York bank. It isn't overseen by the FBI or the Southern District of New York prosecutors. So it has the value of a dollar, the convenience of a dollar, the liquidity of a dollar, but without the oversight that previously went to the dollar. So if there is a golden age to come for criminals, I actually think that crypto dollar-denominated, or I mean other currencies as well, but mainly dollar-denominated crypto, could be a new form of golden age, equivalent to back in the sort of go-go years of the 1970s, before anyone did anything about money laundering at all, because this is setting the dollar free once again. So you have a global currency, but without a global police force. And I mean, it's really interesting. I don't particularly want to get too much into what the Trump White House is getting up to because
We'll talk about that.
because it's so depressing. But they really like the fact that these dollar-denominated stablecoins are doing so well because they maintain the value of their product by buying US government bonds, and other things, but primarily US government bonds. So this is a useful source of demand for the government in the US to sell bonds. But what's really interesting about it is that the USDT is the currency of choice for the Iranian central bank as it tries to find a way around sanctions. It was used by the drug cartels in Colombia and Venezuela. It's used by sanctions evaders in Russia. It has, I'm sure, legitimate customers as well. But it was incredibly popular with the giant scam factories of the Hui One group in Cambodia and Southeast Asia. It is a global currency of choice for money launderers, which is then, you get this sort of captive cash for crypto exchange, whereby on a street-to-street level, the business is in cash. On a country-to-country level, it's done in crypto. It's incredibly convenient, incredibly cheap and easy to use. And yet it's being done, with the full enthusiasm and support of the US government, which is really new. Previously, the US government was what made the running when it came to tackling money laundering. The first law against money laundering is in America in 1970. The first big operations in the Miami Vice years in Florida in the 1980s. And yet this sort of stepping back and saying, let rip, let's earn the money from money laundering instead of stopping it. That's what Britain used to do. That was our place. How are we as Britain supposed to compete in this new world where the Americans are doing this?
So I think you've said a lot of things there, which may be...
Some of them slightly sarcastic, I'd like to point out.
Yeah, that is very important to highlight. The layman might be thinking, okay, treasuries, Bitcoin, Tether, let's break this down. So Bitcoin, currency or money has multiple features or purposes. One thing Bitcoin is very good at doing is being a store of value.
Yeah.
One thing it's very bad at is being a means of exchange. Yeah. Now, money is meant to do these two things and a few other things as well. And I was very familiar with Bitcoin. I wasn't that familiar with Tether. So what's happening is you've got Bitcoin as a store of value, transferable to Tether, which is great as a means of exchange. And it's like you say, it's literally tethered to the dollar. And there is some basis in reality for this. It's not a complete fugazi like Bitcoin because they buy US treasuries. So
and gold and other things, yeah.
So talk to me about Tether because it's quite an extraordinary part of this global infrastructure.
So so Bitcoin is the OG cryptocurrency, and often people associate, if you say cryptocurrency, they mean Bitcoin. That's what they think of. But there are thousands, millions of cryptocurrencies out there. People invent them and try and make them work all the time. Tether was created quite early on when it was there was a lot of enthusiasm about Bitcoin. But it was difficult to trade. It's not very liquid. It's expensive to change hands. It's very volatile. It changes value a lot. And if you just wanted to be in that space, but you didn't want to be exposed to that kind of volatility all the time, they invented Tether as essentially as an analog to the dollar. So you could buy and sell stuff in the crypto space, but without having to use your bank account, because at that time, banks were very, very suspicious of any kind of crypto transactions. They were considered to be a real red flag for money laundering purposes. And so the point of Tether is that, you give them $1, they take that dollar, they spend it on a solid asset. Therefore, if you want your dollar back, they can sell the solid asset and you get your dollar back. That's the idea. Now, there's been a lot of debate about whether they're actually doing that. And there were some issues. There was a court case against them in New York. But, recently, they have been on a real tear. They have been taking off there. I think there's now something like $180 billion worth of Tether out there somewhere. So that's $180 billion that they have to spend on stuff. They recently made a bid for Juventus Football Club. They are cash rich right now. In terms of their reports are not audited by one of the big accountancy firms, but they do declare their profits. And if their profits are correct as they declare them, they are probably the most profitable company per employee that there has ever been. It is an astonishing operation. But what's particularly astonishing about it for me is that this is a company that's declared to be worth probably around $500 billion. That's if it were to list on the stock market, that's probably what it would be worth. And yet, as far as we know from what the chief executive says, it employs maybe 25 compliance officers. Now, if there were a bank worth $500 billion, it would employ tens of thousands of compliance officers to check its transactions. Tether doesn't do that. It's just let's rip. And they will cooperate with law enforcement agencies, but they will cooperate with law enforcement agencies kind of after the fact. So there was a notorious crypto exchange in Moscow called Garantex, which was used for sanctions evasion and all sorts of nasty stuff in Moscow, which the American government sanctioned. Now, if the American government sanctioned something, all Western banks would immediately stop working with it. Tether continued to be traded on that exchange for 2 more years, and it only then finally froze some currency, which it's able to do whenever it likes, when that exchange was finally shut down by a joint operation by the Finns, the Germans, and the American law enforcement agencies. So Tether will just keep going. It doesn't stop in the way that a bank will. And yet, mysteriously, it doesn't get prosecuted for doing this. There was supposedly a case in the works at the end of the Biden administration, but now nothing happens. The Trump administration is very enthusiastic about them. And this may well be because Howard Lutnick, who's a high-up figure in the Trump administration, his financial institution, Cantor Fitzgerald, provided banking services for Tether, and essentially managed to keep them on the road for a long time. And if they do float this company, his family will probably make something around a profit of around $25 billion from doing that. So it is an amazing now and completely unprecedented, to be honest, alliance between some really very fast and loose financial institutions, of which Tether is, I think, the most interesting, but also the Tron blockchain is another one, which is also, really, implicated in an awful lot of very significant financial criminal behavior, and the business interests of close family members of the Trump administration, which do make it really troubling for those of us who are keen to see greater global cooperation against money laundering, because it's hard to see why this government would really do anything at this point to try and crack down on essentially, what are very profitable businesses.
And, the most powerful people in the United States, Elon Musk, I know, has a bunch of stable coins. And, I think Tesla itself has, significant holdings of these kinds of assets. And you said that no bank worth $500 billion, $500 billion would have so few compliance officers. I might be wrong. I mean, market cap changes every day, but I don't think there is a bank in the world worth. Maybe Bank of America is worth $500 billion.
I don't know what something like JP Morgan or something is worth. I have no idea. But I mean, that's a lot of money for a company, isn't it?
I think it would be the biggest bank. That would the biggest.
I don't know about some of the Chinese ones are pretty big. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, it would be. It would be. If there were a financial institution that size, then it would be. Its compliance department would be the size of a small town. Actually, quite a big town.
Put it this way: right now, I think it's bigger than any company in Europe. So, by market cap, so
and more profitable than BlackRock.
Wow.
Its profits are something like $15 billion a quarter. I mean, it employs maybe probably fewer than 200 people. That's a decent chunk of change and of course a significant early investor, as I understand it from other people's reporting, is Christopher Harborne, who is a generous donor to our very own Reform Party.
Wow.
I haven't done that reporting myself, but that's certainly been in The Guardian. Tom Burgess has written about it.
Wow. And of course, Reform, a plausible government, let's be quite frank, are really big on crypto.
Yeah.
Zia Yusuf is tweeting about crypto all the time.
I mean, there is a close alliance now between a lot of the right-wing parties and crypto in a way that is quite troubling to me, because I don't actually think that there is any use case at all for crypto, apart from financial speculation, which it's good for, and fraud, which it's great for, and money laundering, which it's also good for. I don't think there is any other reason why you would want crypto. I might be wrong, but the crypto, the interesting thing, crypto's been around now since Bitcoin's 2008, I think, 2009. It's not new. It's been around for a long time. And the fact that something has been around that long and no one has yet found a use for it.
So I've got one question with two parts. The first is that Bitcoin for a long time was viewed as something which was a danger. It imperiled the dollar, right? 'Cause you now had an alternative. Does it actually enhance the global status of the dollar? And then related to that, is this why people like Trump and Mark Andreessen love it so much? Because actually it makes the dollar more important rather than less important.
I think with Trump, it's important not to overthink things quite often. He used to really hate crypto. He used to talk about it as a foolish, I can't remember exact form of words he used, but he was not complimentary. People started giving him some quite significant donations. And then he realized, I think, with the launch of the Trump meme coin and the Melania meme coin, as well as his own crypto company, World Liberty Financial, which has brought in some very sizable investments from some interesting individuals, that this is a very profitable way of carrying on. It is. I mean, it's a great way of fleecing a large number of people. So I think in that regard, he is pretty transactional about it. More broadly, in that kind of right-wing space, I think that there is a distrust of the woke financial system, a distrust of the fact that there are checks on transactions. And they genuinely like the fact that you can pay anyone you like to do anything you like with cryptocurrencies, and therefore essentially managing to do an end run around the compliance system that stops you laundering money, because it means you can fund, any political cause you like, you can fund any person you like. And, it is inherently very corrupting. And particularly, I think, in the US, where they are ahead of us, but also I think you see this in Russia, and probably in other places too. The use of crypto as a way of corrupting people is really becoming deeply entrenched. And that's quite sad if you think about what crypto was originally intended to be, a thing about personal liberty, about, everyone being their own, the boss of their own affairs. The idea that this is instead being used as a way essentially to oppress us by corrupting people is pretty dispiriting, really. Do you remember that everyone would talk about blockchain? Blockchain was the answer to everything, And now people don't, it's AI now. People have stopped talking about blockchain.
NFTs.
NFTs.
I was in Vancouver in 2021 doing a TED talk, actually, and everybody was talking about NFTs and blockchain.
Yeah.
And, reading this book, I mean, you didn't talk about NFTs too specifically, but, if there's somebody on X and people are mocking them for being the stupid money, for buying something which looks really stupid and has no value, it's probably money laundering. I'm not going to say any specific names because, of course, that's not fair. But as a broader phenomenon, it does seem quite shady.
There is money laundering. I mean, you said at the beginning, you see money laundering everywhere. That's true. I mean, one of the amazing things about looking into money laundering is that you see it everywhere. And so this is my third book now about financial crime. And when I was researching the first book, which is more about kleptocracy, the birth of kleptocracy in places like Russia and Nigeria and so on, I was so appalled by what I was discovering about Western complicity in this, that I assumed, this is quite hilariously naive thinking about it, but I assumed that the problem would be solved before I managed to get the book out. I was really like dashing against time because I didn't want to be essentially describing a phenomenon that had now ended. But spoiler, that problem was not solved before the book came out, or indeed at all. And I then, wrote another book about British complicity in financial crime and so on. And now it's a third book about money laundering and the global failure to stop it. And I have become, really accustomed to the fact that, people will say, oh, that's terrible, oh, we should do something about that, but not actually do something about that. There's this really good saying that I only discovered relatively recently, but which is, lots of people know, that the purpose of a system is what it does. And you can listen to what people say, and we desperately want to do something about that. But really what you need to look at is what it does. And what the global money laundering system does is cost a huge amount of money, which is a cost on all of us. We all pay that. It victimizes already marginalized people and kicks them out of the financial system. And it does nothing at all to stop criminals or terrorists from, enjoying their ill-gotten gains or doing whatever it is that they want to do. And that's the truth. That's what we need to recognize. And just as an example, and again, this is, sort of an anecdote and plural of anecdote isn't data, but, when the Labour Party was still in opposition, I went out for a cup of coffee with an advisor to a senior shadow cabinet member, because they wanted some ideas for the conference speech, things to do about tackling financial crime and kleptocracy, things they could put in there so they could show how tough they were on these important causes. And they said to me, if you were, in charge, what would be the one thing you'd do? And I'd say, well, I'd provide adequate forcing to our law enforcement agencies so they'd be able to, actually do some work. And he was like, oh, that's not going to get us a headline, is it? And it was really a depressing sort of realization of what's actually the motivation for a lot of politicians, and I use this parallel sometimes. It feels like, someone wants to get fit, it's a bit out of shape or very out of shape and they want to get fit. So they go and buy a shiny piece of exercise equipment, whether it's a Fitbit or a treadmill or an exercise bike or whatever. And everyone's like, oh, well done you, look at that. Great, look, exercise bike. God, that's great. You're going to be so fit. That's amazing. And then, you could use the exercise bike, but like, I mean, that's quite hard work, isn't it? It's quite boring. So instead of that, you just go and buy another shiny piece of exercise equipment and you put it next to it. And everyone's like, oh, well done you, a treadmill. You must be really serious now. And it's like that. It feels like that governments now have an entire home gym that's full of every single elliptical trainer and Peloton and everything, and none of which have ever been used, because it's so much easier just to pass a piece of legislation or demand, something from other people, when actually doing something yourself requires really some hard choices and a lot of hard work and a lot of focus, and frankly, no one can be bothered.
I think about this a lot with vape shops. So, allegedly in June last year, we banned single-use vapes. Now, they've gotten around this a little bit because if it's got a port at the back, it's technically not single use and whatever. I mean, you should be able to get rid of that. I was walking past a vape shop where I live. I live on the South Coast. I was walking past the other day, and giant poster on the front window, disposable vapes. Now, I know they're probably playing it both ways, and actually the vapes inside are technically legal. I get that. But isn't it extraordinary that the government banned something a year ago? There can be a giant advert for disposable vapes, opposite a school, by the way. And I know for a fact trading standards won't go there. They won't go there because they don't exist anymore. They've been defunded to such an extent. If you talk to tobacconists or newsagents, legit people, they say, well, I just don't sell cigarettes anymore because people are buying smuggled, cheap tobacco. So many people are buying it, and there's just no enforcement of anything anymore. And rather than enforce the things, as you said to this advisor, it's just, we want a headline, create a new law, create a new regulation. And I sometimes put it on X, creation of infinity new laws rather than just enforce the ones we've already got. And it does just seem now the default of our political class. And I say political class because it seems to be both parties that think like this.
I thought about this a lot when I was writing about pollution in rivers and the water companies. And this, particularly under the coalition government, there was this massive gutting of the enforcement budget of the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales. And I was sort of trying to come up with a pithy way of describing it, this kind of legalisation by under enforcement, But it's also a sort of, there's also, like you say, there's a performative aspect to it of like performatively tough, and going out there and you see it in the US far more with like, going out there and, doing a speech in front of a prison in El Salvador or whatever. I mean, it's become, just the facade with no substance. And a lot of the stuff about money laundering is that, there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of regulations, but what that means is the people who are determined to do the right thing just have more and more and more rules to follow and more paperwork to do. And people who don't do the right thing, they don't do any of it and there's no downside. So it's a tax on the good guys and, and no disincentive at all to the bad guys. So it is it's just appallingly badly designed, run, created system. And, I have as a friend of mine, Jason Sharman, who's a professor at Cambridge University, and, he likes to shock compliance conferences by saying he would abolish compliance. And I wouldn't go that far, but, we certainly would need to, have a complete, put your foot on the ball and say, is this game worth playing?
Another thing from a local context I want to ask you, because the book really focuses quite rightly on this as a global phenomenon, but I feel like when I walk into my local street, I just see so much of it. There's a block of buildings near where we live, near our high street, and they have 3 restaurants in them. And every 2 years, the restaurants shut, and it's like they're on rotation. So there's an Italian restaurant, nobody goes in there for 2 years, they spend tens of thousands of pounds to do it up. It then shuts after 2 years. Then 6 months later, the same restaurant is, 20 meters away, and there's a Moroccan restaurant there. Then the Moroccan restaurant goes, there's a Greek restaurant, and nobody actually ever goes to these restaurants. And I've spoken to people about this, and it's one of two things as I understand. It's either money laundering, so I'd like to ask you about that, or it's about people with property portfolios, and the value of the property is indexed to the amount of rent they were getting from the last tenant. So basically they have fake tenants paying fake amounts of rent in order to boost the value of their portfolio, which allows them to borrow more money. But of course, that also means that the fake rent is probably laundered cash. And I just think, I just live in a small town, and it seems so pervasive. Like I said, it seems everywhere. Am I just being conspiratorial, or do you think this is quite a common thing across the country?
So I would genuinely say in answer to that and many other questions, because I quite often get asked about particular, very strange, businesses, and you think, how is that possible? How is it possible that there's a shop there which only sells watermelons or whatever? Is it money laundering? And to which the answer is, possibly could be someone's hobby, but probably not, is if you can imagine it as a way of laundering money, someone's doing it. Yeah, this is an incredibly entrepreneurial world. People are constantly looking for new ways to move money, new ways to legalize money. There is a giant market out there for the provision of money laundering solutions. If you are a criminal and you've got money and you want it to be laundered and you want to keep as much of it as you can, then you're always going to be looking for new people who can do that service for you. And it is, it is astonishing how visible so much of it is once you start looking out for it. But then, it often goes alongside other forms of crime. Like you say, is it money laundering, or is it about, essentially defrauding people on the rent? Yes, and, why not do both? The crime which I end the book by talking about, just because it's a success, and I was like, what does success look like, was a crime that was incredibly prevalent in the UK about 20 years ago, called carousel fraud. It's still epidemic across the European Union because they didn't take it so seriously at the same time, and it's so deeply entrenched now that I have no idea whether it'd be possible to solve, which is it's a way of defrauding the VAT system. I'm not going to go into how it works, but it involves essentially importing and exporting high-value goods, at the time often mobile phones, and defrauding the VAT, which you pay or don't pay in that case, to unbelievable quantities. That was something which was just completely in plain sight. It was happening all the time, absolutely everywhere, in the same way as what you're talking about with vape shops, and you see it with candy shops and lots of other different kinds of shops that you're like, how can that possibly be legal? And if you read about the efforts the government went to try and stop carousel fraud and successfully essentially stop it, it was incredibly hard, but incredibly successful. It was a full all-of-government effort. They mobilized law enforcement, diplomatic service. They came up with new laws. They came up with new education campaigns. All of it at the same time. All of it, very intelligence-led, very clever, very well worked out, and incredibly successful. And that's what's needed against everything. A recognition that this matters, that there are real victims of the crimes. This isn't just, it's not just a vape shop. It's not just a candy shop. This is part of a giant system, and you need to tackle it as a system. And that requires all of government working together. You can't just outsource this to banks. You can't say, oh, well, they'll just file a few more suspicious activity reports and one day we'll get around to reading them. That's a crazy way of doing it. It's not only very expensive, but it's really ineffective.
So if hopefully it's not just one advisor of a member of the now government rather than a shadow minister, but hopefully lots of people will listen and watch you, not just on this video, but other ones too, other podcasts that read the book. What kinds of things are you proposing to not solve this? It can't be solved, certainly not in the short to medium term, but to mitigate it. What are the policy proposals for a government that has 5 years to do stuff?
So, the really obvious one is just get rid of £50 notes. There's no reason to have them. And hopefully that would then be an example, would start a conversation, and you would end up with other governments also saying, in the Eurozone, they'd say, actually, why do we have 100 and 200 euro notes, or even 50 euro notes? And then the US, they might say, why do we have a $100 bill? But you can do the right thing even if you're doing it on your own. And it's so easy to do. You could just do it straight away. It wouldn't really make any difference. That I would love to see as a commitment to tackling this. Tackling crypto is hard, not least because of the political overtones to it. But also so much of it is happening in the US now, or happening in El Salvador and other places. But we do have expertise in law enforcement now. They've come a couple of successful operations against crypto. And that, you can invest in that, and you could become, essentially, this is the coming crime. You could try and get ahead of this before it happens, before it really sweeps over everything. That would be something I would love to see governments do as part of a really well-resourced and well-intelligenced, just proper investment in law enforcement tackling financial crime. There's so much of the discussion now, as we've seen again, is about freeing up resources to have bobbies on the beat, with the idea that all you need is some guy on a bicycle with a whistle cycling through a village in an Agatha Christie novel, and that's going to solve all of the problems of the world. Great. Okay, I can see that that's reassuring for local communities, but you need to understand that the kind of crimes that people want reassurance from, which is things like mobile phone theft, or watch theft, or those kind of street thefts that are really upsetting, that is part of a criminal system which relies on money laundering. No one's going to go around stealing phones, smuggling them out of the country or whatever, if you can't launder the profits, because it would be, you wouldn't do it for its own sake. This isn't something people do for fun. So it is I would love that understanding that this isn't an either or. You can have those kind of street level reassuring patrols to stop phone theft while also having really well resourced, well intelligenced law enforcement agencies going after the kingpins who are moving this money. And that, it's not easy, but, it's certainly possible. And yeah, I mean, there are so many other things I could say about the way that, the international money laundering regulations work and so on, but that's, for another day. But that, just for a government, those two things, get rid of £50 notes and then properly resource up a National Crime Agency and so on to really take on the support network for all of the street crimes that we are also concerned about.
Oliver, great book, great conversation. Hopefully we'll make some progress in the next couple of years on this.
Be good, wouldn't it? Thanks very much.
Been a pleasure.